All right. Since that's out of the way, I assume everyone is good, so I'll be starting right now. We affirm the results. The EU should automatically offer membership to any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state. Now, for a little bit of background, there are basically three steps to becoming an EU member. The first is becoming recognized as a candidate for membership. And then after becoming an EU candidate, formal membership negotiations occur, which involves like the adoption of EU law and implementation of like reforms and stuff so that they're in line with this EU law. And then finally, after all that's done, the country can officially join the EU. However, when it comes to seceding nations, many mother nations are able to block them from ever taking that first step and becoming a candidate. Basically, since the candidacy itself takes a majority of the EU to approve it, these mother nations can apply pressure to the other member states in order to block the newly seceded nation from even entering the EU as a candidate. That brings us to our plan text. I'll be posting in the chat. Basically, just says the EU should enact a policy that would automatically make any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state a candidate for the EU membership as soon as possible. It'll happen through normal ways and means. And give me a second, post the plan text. Actually, my part, I'll do that. All right, anyway, frameworks can be net benefits. Our first advantage is strengthening the seceding nation. This occurs in two ways. The first is during the actual secession. Secession often leads to cutting of ties between the originary and the secessionary nations, which causes great economic harm. However, Robert Young from the New York Times explains in 2012 that granting the secessionary nations candidacy and possible membership can help offset this economic harm, as it would allow for trade to still happen with those two nations. He gives the example of how if Catalonia were to split and still have access to the EU, huge economic harms in the trade between Spain and Catalonia would be avoided. And then secondly, is after ensuring the survival of these secessionary countries. Vox EU in 2014 explains that on average, European countries are 12% richer a decade after they join the EU. Furthermore, Soman from the Washington Post adds that the secession often has significant transition costs, as setting up a new government and dismantling the old regime is often an expensive process. The costs are likely to be particularly high if the pre-existing state and its rulers try to resist a secession. As is the case for certain EU member states and former member states, the establishment of trade connections between countries can often save the secessionary states, thus preventing a majority of its population from going into poverty. Also, just keep in mind how EU nations can't go to war with each other. So as soon as one becomes a candidate for an EU member, it's like basically prevents the mother nation from going after the seceded nation, which again protects its citizens and protects the secessionary state from being attacked by its original mother state, which of course is going to be very good for that mother or for the secessionary state and for the mother state. The second advantage is actually strengthening the EU overall. Now, passing this policy increases the strength of the EU for a couple of key reasons. Firstly, it boosts the overall hegemony of the EU. This hegemonic increase occurs in two main ways. Firstly, when a nation secedes, it interrupts the geographical continuity of the EU and opens up weaknesses along the EU that countries like China and Russia step into, lowering the hard power of the EU overall pretty significantly. However, by automatically offering membership to these seceding states, the EU is able to shore up against any potential creeping plans from either of these two countries, stabilizing their hard power. Secondly, it increases the hedge of the EU by increasing global perception or bettering global perception of the EU. Basically, by stepping in and helping this fledgling country get on its feet or get on its basically get on its feet, they're able to portray themselves as a good and just actor. And the EU being able to portray themselves as such is very beneficial because that means just by passing this policy, the EU is able to increase its global soft power and increase its own hegemony. This increase in hegemony shores up potential weaknesses against encroaching nations like China or Russia, which obviously is going to be very key, as well as allowing for more soft power, which can be used in negotiations and the like. Now, the second way that this policy strengthens the EU is by strengthening the states inside of it. When a nation secedes, it inherently weakens the country that it seceded from, the mother nation. Since the plan text specifies that these mother nations have to be former or current EU states, this means that the weakening of the mother country impacts the EU overall negatively because, again, it's a member state. However, by allowing for the seceded nation to become part of the EU automatically, the plan checks back against this weakening. You can look back to the first advantage where we explained to you how both the seceded nation actually receive many benefits and are strengthened overall, and additionally how the mother nation is prevented from harming itself by trying to basically go after this seceded nation. And as a result of it basically strengthening its member nations, it inherently will strengthen the EU overall because they are member nations. And then additionally, by enabling the trade between the mother and seceded nation, it means the mother nation receives almost no harms whatsoever against strengthening the EU. Now, this is because originally, as we explained earlier, when a nation secedes from its mother nation, it inherently weakens it because it cuts off that basically sector, and it no longer has access to everything that was within that seceded nation. As a result of it no longer having that access, it inherently weakens its ability to trade with other countries, and inherently weakens it to other like encroaching countries, as we explained earlier. And by having by enabling the trade between the mother and seceded nations, it basically shores up against it and acts against that basically because instead of the sector being permanently inaccessible and having like bad relations between the two countries, by it being an EU member state, it will basically overcome that bad communication and allow for better communication overall between the two states. And as a result of that, it of course strengthens the mother's nation and the seceded nation. And for those reasons, because it strengthens the EU and it strengthens the seceded nations while offering almost no harms whatsoever, we strongly affirm.
Okay. Is everybody ready? Great. Quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go on my own case, and then I'm going to rebut their contentions. If everybody is ready, then I will begin my time now. Good morning, judges. My name is Molly Carroll Thompson. I will be the leader of the opposition for this motion. What I'm going to do for you in this speech is first go over my own case, which involves one observation and then two contentions, and then I'll go into my opponent's case, right? First of all, the observation is that on the side opposition, they can still apply for EU membership in like at a later date the normal way. We're debating whether or not the EU should immediately offer them membership. So we're not saying these countries will never become a member of the European Union. They can apply for it later. Moving on to my first contention, which is that these countries are most likely not a good candidate. The criteria you must meet before joining the European Union is a stable institution guaranteeing democracy and a functioning market economy and the capacity to cope with competition and market forces in the EU, right? There are two like unique trains of warranting here, right? If it's seceding from a state that is a current EU member, right? This is gonna like a bit more warranting than the other option, right? I think that it most likely won't meet the requirements. This country is newly formed. It probably doesn't have a stable government, which is one of the requirements for joining the EU. It's newly been split off and hasn't had the time, especially if it's happening immediately after they are seceding, it hasn't had the time to actually establish a good democratic government that's working correctly and like makes people actually happy, right? We also think that because it's going to be a smaller nation and hasn't had the time to like establish the trade networks it already has, it's going to have a really difficult time competing with competitions of big EU names like bigger countries in the European Union, right? Also, states that succeed often do fail. Like we can look at South Sudan for an example. Obviously, this isn't in Europe, but like as immediately after seceding, South Sudan is like now on the brink of collapse. The economy is in shambles. It has huge inflation. Parts of the countries are like in famine, things like that. Just one example of like a state seceding and then everything going really badly for it as the economy just like sort of immediately failed because they weren't ready to secede, right? So we think that it's likely that this country, because it's so new, won't meet the requirements. If it's from a former EU member, then we think that this is even more likely to happen because the odds that the country it's coming from have like a super stable economy that align with the EU's values are really small because it hasn't been accepted into the EU yet, or like it left the EU, right? This means that this country probably has an even less stable economy and like doesn't even have any sort of argumentation that they can give you about like why coming from a bigger country would allow them to create their own economy right now, right? So why is this super bad? We think it's bad for the state and bad for the European Union. Why is it bad for the state? Because this could lead to another situation, sort of like what happened in Greece, right? Where it starts sort of like leeching off of the other countries and doesn't have the time to actually establish its own economy. I think that this will be bad for the state. Obviously, it'll cause a lot of inflation and bad economic impacts for them. We also think it's bad for the European Union for a couple reasons. First of all the economic stuff, like just in general, having a state that isn't extremely stable isn't good for it, just on a more practical level, but also because it doesn't really meet the requirements. It'll make the EU seem a lot more lax with like membership and things like that, which we think isn't a good look for the European Union. It will make it look like as stronger and penetrable to other nations, which means it's more likely to like face conflict with other nations because they'll see it as sort of a weaker state. Our second contention is backlash. There's two subpoints under this. The first type of backlash we think they may face is from the country they seceded from. We think that they likely like might be angry that they're being offered immediate membership. This is really important when we talk about like Spain, which is a really recent example, right? Like Catalonia is trying to secede from Spain currently, and the Spanish response has been extremely firm, saying that like any sort of referendum is like illegal and secession is like quote madness, right? But obviously most likely the referendum will come, right? And essentially if we do this thing where they're being offered immediate, so essentially in the status quo, right, Spain would try like everything in its power to veto Catalonia from being involved in the European Union. And to quote one article, it says that I can link in the chat if you guys would like. It's from New York Times article that to allow Catalonia to actually have admission to the EU would have to require all of its leverage to be used against Spain to like create this. This means that Spain strongly opposes Catalonia from like being committed into the European Union. I think that what this will do is like increase tensions between the country that it's seceding from and other countries in the European Union, right? European Union is supposed to be sort of like a united front against other countries, and they're supposed to have like really good trade relations and things like that with the other countries. We think that if we mess up any sort of relation that the EU has with each other, this will be generally bad, right? We also think that they'll be angry if independence is made easy for them. States will also may view this as incentivizing seceding, which is generally bad, right? It gives states more of an incentive to secede if when they immediately do, they're going to be offered EU membership and things like that. So like whether or not that's true, we think the perception from countries in the EU is that the European Union is like trying to get states to secede from them, which they'll generally view as bad. Second subpoint under this is that countries who have been waiting a really long time to get into the EU will also be angry about this because other people are getting priority over them. There are 5 recognized candidates for membership of the European Union: Turkey, which applied in 1987, so that's a really long time ago, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and Serbia, right? And they've all started accession negotiations. I think that these countries will generally be really mad if, say, like Brussels or Catalonia gets priority over them. This not only means that they're going to be waiting longer because their negotiations will be slowed if the EU turns its focus onto other negotiations, and like only 20% of people think that European governments want Turkey in the European Union, even in the status quo, right? And only 8% of Turks feel relations with the European Union are strong because it hasn't been accepted yet. We think that what this will do is like heighten that even more, because not only is it not being accepted, other countries that are pretty much brand new are being accepted over it, right? So the longer these countries are waiting around, we think the more they're going to have tense relations with the EU, the more strained their relations are, and the more likely they are to like involve themselves with trade and things in the European Union. And also, so not only does the perceived like cutting in line make them pissed off, they're also angry because the longer they wait, the less they think that the European Union wants them. We think this is bad for those countries, like nationalism and morale and things like that. And the public opinion of the European Union will be worse, especially with countries that neighbor them, which is going to like generally have a negative impact on the European Union in the future. Moving on to my opponent's case, the first thing they tell you is that many mother nations are able to block this and like block membership through pressure. First of all, yes, we tell you they do have like the ability to do this. But first of all, we think that this is more of an issue with like Spain and countries like that. A lot of the current countries that are talking about seceding actually don't want to veto them. Like for example, Scotland, the UK wouldn't want to veto it. And there are other examples of this as well. Like while we provide you one example of this happening, that would be really bad because Spain is such a big superpower, a lot of the countries wouldn't actually block membership. My opponents also don't tell you why this is so bad, right? Moving on to their first contention, that it strengthens the seceding nation. We tell you that first of all, the nation isn't established currently. It wouldn't actually be strengthened. I give you a lot of warranting as to why it like might actually fail instead. We also tell you that there's not much warranting as to why the EU would care about whether or not a seceding state exceeds or not. They don't give you much warranting as to like the inherent benefit the seceding state provides to the European Union, or whether or not the European Union should care about it in general. So I would love to see the impacting on that. Their second contention is the strengthening of the EU overall and like global perception. We tell you that other states probably don't care whether or not a seceded country is accepted, right? Like Russia and the US aren't going to really care whether or not Catalonia is accepted in the European Union. It really doesn't affect them unless like it actually does affect them. They're more interested in like self-interest and bigger issues than like a small country joining the EU. They also tell you that the weakening of the mother state is prevented. We tell you that the mother nation could still have access. They could develop their own trade networks between it. Or if you buy their own logic, the tensions are going to be so high between them and the mother nation that they're like going to block trade in general and try and veto them out of the EU. We think that this trade relation wouldn't exist in either world, meaning it's basically non-unique. And for all of these reasons, I strongly urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Order is going to be the plan, the observation, and then down our case, and then their case. Okay. Starting. First, on the plan text, you have to realize a key portion of the plan text is that in the scenario that we're only granting them candidacy for EU membership, which means that they aren't automatically becoming part of the EU right as they secede from the nation, or that they aren't automatically moving into the EU, thus cutting the line or causing any of the tensions they're causing. Because what happens after the candidacy is they move on to formal membership negotiations, a process that involves the adoption of established EU laws, which means that this is where they'll have to fill in those necessary criteria that our opponents have been talking about. Essentially, the states having to be stable, the states having to have like a good, decent government, and many more that they're talking about, all fall into this established EU law and this accession criteria, which is where our plan automatically takes out the first contention, right? Because it essentially tells you that these states are gaining access to the EU through the same route like many others are through this candidacy, but all we're doing is like providing them a route to grow and essentially grow into like the trade areas. Now let's move on to the
POI.
Yeah.
What differs side F from the status quo if you're basically just letting them apply?
No, we're not letting them apply, right? Because in order to become candidacy, you need to like pass like through a somewhat of a vote, and that's where the veto part really comes into play, and that's what I was going to get to with the observation, in the sense that many mother nations, as you said, are have like very tense relations with the state that has secedes, so they prevent this like candidacy from ever occurring because they don't want that nation to ever join the EU. Thus, they like veto the candidacy from even ever occurring. That's why it's so important to establish this policy, so that we can grant them that candidacy without like bypassing the mother state's veto. Now, moving forward, onto our case. The first thing they say that the nation isn't established and it might fail. Refer back to the response I made with the plan text and how like the EU would make sure about that. But even furthermore, they don't really respond to this in the scenario that they like simply talk about. The EU won't see much benefit, but we'll come back to that when I go on to my second contention. But in the scenario that like what we're talking about in this specific example is ensuring the survival of these secessionary countries, right? Because as they said, a lot of these secessionary countries are unstable from the beginning, and they like have a ton of significant transition costs and lack of like trade relationships, right? But with with access to the EU, remember how Vox EU tells you in 2014 that on average European countries are 12% richer a decade after they joined the EU, thus helping these like secessionary countries grow into an actual stable nation and actually grow into a nation that we want. Secondly, a lot of these like secessionary countries, in fact, what BBC tells you is that mostly new states emerge from situations where ethnic groups have been either victims of genocide or other major human rights abuses, right? And so we're granting these like ethnic groups a chance to actually grow in a nation where they can succeed and they can like grow without human rights abuses, which is going to be really key. But also, thirdly, is what they don't respond to is the link between how when a nation splits off, right? When secession happens, both countries face this like inherent harm to trade, right? Like for example, if Catalonia splits off from Spain and Catalonia's trade would be immensely harmed. And given how important Catalonia's economy is to Spain, it would cause a huge economic harm not only to Catalonia but also to Spain. But if Catalonia were to be granted candidacy to the EU, Spain would have to recognize like what a New York Times article explains is that Spain would have to essentially recognize that they can establish this trade again, and it would better like trade relationship between Catalonia and Spain, which is gonna ultimately be reducing this impact of like the secession and avoiding as much instability as possible during that time of secession, which is gonna be really key. But on to our next point on like strengthening the EU. Now, they say we don't really want this. The warrant is really clear here. When a nation secedes from the EU, it interrupts the geographical continuity of the EU and opens up weaknesses along the EU that other countries like China and Russia can step into, thus lowering their hard and soft power in that nation. Because for trade to really like work and trade to really be connected in those regions, there needs to be geographical continuity in a way where trade can like happen even easier. But what often ends up happening is that secessionary nations often don't end up like joining the EU due to like the vetoes from the mother states, which causes this gaps in like geographical continuity in the EU. So like their how a New York Times article like compares it is to Swiss cheese, right? There's like holes in between like their geographical continuity, which ultimately worsens their ability to not only like better trade and better the economy, but also it allows countries like China and Russia to step into, thus lowering EU's hegemony and bettering theirs. But also the second point is that it enables trade between the seceding nation, because often seceding nations like Catalonia and Ireland, etc., are really important to the EU global economy. And if these secede and aren't a part of the EU anymore, you're going to see various harms coming to the EU in and of itself. Now, onto their case. First, you can take, while they can join later, the issue, you can cross-apply our observation in the beginning, in which we tell you that mother states often veto the candidacy in the beginning, hence why this offering the candidacy is so important. But also, furthermore, you can take out the whole first contention on the idea of like what the plan does, especially based on the candidacy arc. And as that candidacy arc makes sure that these states are not only stable, but they're also like decent states when they join, and that they have like these human rights abuses. And we can look to a couple examples. States that they give like the example of South Sudan, that states that secede often fail. But if we look to specifically European examples, we can look to like Estonia and Slovakia, which actually had huge economic prosperity after they were able to join the EU. In this case, like Estonia and Slovakia like split off from other states that didn't really veto their state, but the states that we're seeing undergo like huge secession movements right now are ones where the mother states have clearly expressed that they would veto this, especially when we're looking at like Ireland and Scotland and Catalonia, in which they themselves say like there's a bunch of tension, hence why they won't really be able to join the EU due to the veto. Furthermore, when they say like odds are that the country have a fairly unstable economy from where it comes, when you look at like EU states, they don't generally have that much of an unstable. When you look at the secessionary states right now, they're coming from like Spain and UK, which don't generally have unstable economies. And the whole point is that former states have unstable economies, but that's not like EU doesn't generally kick out members. If it's a former state, it generally left the EU on its own basis, such as the UK and Brexit, right? Which ultimately means that the state wasn't unstable because it was kicked out of the EU, or it isn't even unstable then. It just didn't decide to like stay in the EU ultimately. Which, like for example, if you look at the UK I'd say still has a fairly stable economy, yet it's still a former EU state due to like Brexit, right? Then when you move on to like the impacts, leeching off simply establishing trade relations doesn't mean the state is leeching off other countries. It means that the state has international trade relations that's going to help it ultimately grow. On the EU impact of creating an extremely unstable region, that happens without allowing these secessionary states to grow. Because like we tell you in case, that lack of geographical continuity is what's causing like these extremely unstable regions inside the EU, where trade can't happen as best as it should. Next, on the idea of like Spain going to be mad in using leverage, that is exactly why we should grant this candidacy, because those countries that are going to be mad aren't allowing these countries to join. But if these countries gain that candidacy, they can ultimately move on, and thus we negate. Affirm, my bad.
All right. Quick off-time roadmap. I'm just going to start with plan and then the abusive call, and then I'm going to go gov case, op case. All right. I'll start my time now. So beginning with why exactly their plan is abusive, starting with the fact that the plan is sort of used as a rebuttal to a lot of our own case, starting with the second speaker, which is traditionally not really how it's done, but it's fine. I'm just going to call it abusive in my speech because this is just the only time when I can do so. They basically say that like there are 3 steps for becoming a member. We assume that this was applying to side op, right? Because that's the side where you still have to apply to be a member. In the motion, it explicitly states offer membership. There's no offer membership with any caveats. That caveats aren't included in the motion. All these things offer membership. And if offer membership mean you are offering membership without any caveats. And if you are offering membership with caveats, it's essentially the same thing as just allowing these states to apply for membership on their own, meaning that there's literally no inherent difference between side gov and side op, because we say in our observation, which they don't deny, that in the op world, as is our right to say the status quo, they can still apply for this. And if in the government world, they're just going to basically be applying for this and going through this entire veto process, then there's no difference between side gov and side op. And because the government has to be defending the motion, because the opposition in this round is defending the status quo, there must be a difference, and this should result in an automatic opposition ballot. Just clearly, motion clearly defines it as saying membership. It's not offering application. So they're defining A as B. This is just inherently wrong. The second thing is that they're making government argue for argue the side of opposition. There's no difference in our cases so long as they try to refute our first contention by saying that, oh, actually these states are the weakened states are not going to be the ones joining the EU because the EU is going to spend all this time in the application process and they're going to have to change all these laws. That is side opposition, right? That is the side on which they have to apply for membership, like Turkey, like all these places, and they're waiting around for things to happen. If there's no difference, then you should automatically award the ballot to side op. Again, it's unfair, it's unpredictable, there's an extreme amount of prep skew here. It's also just not allowing for a really educational debate to occur because we have these differences. The two sides aren't really all that different. If applying for membership equals applying for membership, like what is there really to debate? I'm just going to do my best to say with what we have and move on to actual refutations, because in general, I think theory is kind of a pointless way to debate. Okay. Their first contention is strengthening the seceding nation. Again, this is kind of why their definitions are abusive, because if this country is indeed unstable, then the EU won't accept them under their own definitions, and they have zero impacts, right? Like if they're not strengthening a nation which is weak, and they're just strengthening a nation which is already strong, as in the only nations they're going to accept automatically or after only a short amount of like vetoing, then they have no impacts because they're not actually strengthening anybody, and we would have this exact same impacts under side up. But let's move on under like why exactly this won't happen. They try to say that like the possible membership offsets the harm because trade can still happen. First of all, it's important to note that like trade can happen under any scenario. Trade is not like specific to the EU. Sure, trade is made easier by the EU, but people that aren't involved in the EU can still trade. Like the US trades with the EU. The EU is like an entity with which one can trade with. The US trades with China. We don't have like a European Union agreement with China. Trade is still possible without the European Union. Second of all, they try to like bring this back to their Vox statistic, which says that like European countries are 12% richer after joining. I'd like to highlight the fact that because this statistic has been taken in the status quo, this can basically be used for the side opposition. Just turn this to say basically in the status quo in which you have to go through this large membership application in order to be accepted, so we can make sure that weak countries aren't joining the EU. That's when they get 12% richer. The government is arguing for a side of the unknown. They have no idea what's going to happen when we start accepting countries like left and right without having any sort of verification and things like that. Let's see. Okay. So again, a lot of this is just non-unique because trade can happen with the EU. They say like EU candidates can't just go to war with each other. Normal people don't just go to war with each other. Like this law was established a long time ago after like the Crusades and all these things were really awful for like all of humankind. But why don't people just go to war with each other? Because war is generally a bad thing. You kill a lot of people. It worsens morale. It makes people not like the government. Like we just see there's no incentive to go to war with these countries. It's just not going to happen under side opposition. So I don't see why it could be used as offense under side government. Their second contention is strengthening the EU overall. They try to like bring up this idea of like, oh, the EU has holes when they don't have like countries involved, and China and Russia are going to take advantage of these holes and like hack into the EU or something. I don't really see where their impacts come about, because obviously if these people aren't in the EU, they're not going to get any information about the EU from them. Second of all, because the EU already has holes, like China and Russia have many experienced hackers who've been able to hack into plenty of places that aren't already the EU. Third of all, there's no empirical evidence to support anything of the sort. Like they just don't have the evidence here, and the logic here is sorely lacking. And then I don't know, what am I at? Fifth of all, like these states are often really small and don't really have much to offer. Succession is usually about ethnic differences. They try to bring up this idea that like, oh, Catalonia is going to be such a huge loss to like the entire EU when Catalonia, if and when Catalonia doesn't become part of the EU. First of all, we tell you that Catalonia can still apply for membership to the EU, which is why in their whole case is abusive. But second of all, we tell you that like if Catalonia does not become part of the EU, because the EU is so huge, like Catalonia is a blip on their radar. Catalonia alone does not provide anything that the other states in the EU cannot like make up for. It's just, they're just not integral to the EU. These states are smaller than their like larger states. And third of all, like these states can obviously make up the difference by accepting a country like Turkey, like Algeria, other countries that are waiting for application to the EU, which is our main backlash point, which they never respond to. They say like it boosts the overall hegemony of the EU by using soft power. Again, I would say this is non-unique because according to their own logic, this happens when you accept any country in. So we could get the same thing by accepting like Albania into the EU, and we wouldn't see any difference by their own logic. So I would just call this non-unique. Like I don't think it should flow through. Their second point here is like the weakening of the mother state is prevented. Again, like the weakening of mother state is pretty much inevitable if indeed the mother state is so set against trading with the country that left them. Like even in the EU, nobody's forcing you to trade with anybody. So basically, it's all up to the mother state. And again, this is just a non-unique impact. But again, there's a bigger idea here over perception over reality. Like if both a seceding nation and the mother nation are prevented from harming itself, it's not really about like what's actually going on here. There's going to be a perception of an antagonism and like the idea of other when this country leaves them, and so we ultimately see like the relations are not going to be good. And that brings me straight to my backlash point, which I think is the most important thing to this round, because if indeed this motion has no solvency, as we say, it is not because of our backlashing, because people are going to be so annoyed, because people are going to be so angry that people are being considered before them, that countries that have left them are now being automatically considered for EU membership. We think this is going to be a huge blow to these countries that view themselves as like the most powerful entity ever. And because this ultimately would have no solvency or wouldn't be able to take effect, that's also another reason why it would be an automatic opposition ballot. Just going into more of this, like specifically, our entire first contention, all their rebuttals rely on their plan text, and that just further proves why it's abusive. Like if you're relying on your plan to tell us why our argument is wrong, then there's something wrong with your plan, because your plan should not be able to be used to shut down opposition logic. Second contention is backlash. Basically, what they try to do is they bypass the veto, which is what leads to backlash from nations that want to succeed. However, on our side, many countries don't actually want to veto them. It's just the idea that they would be mad if the option of vetoing them is taken away. We don't see any response to our actual logic here. So you can just look at what my partner said in her first speech. In general, we think people are mad when you offer these options, especially when it looks like they're essentially cutting in line in front of you. For all these reasons, I encourage an opposition ballot. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go abusive call and then just straight into weighing. Is everybody ready? Yes.
I'll just wait for a thumbs up from Judge David.
Okay.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. I'll begin my time. Now I'm trying to like not spend too much time on this, but essentially their plan is abusive. My partner gives you a lot of warranting for this. The motion clearly says offering membership, not offering application. They're essentially making Gov just argue for op. It's unfair, unpredictable. This allows for many arguments the opposition should be able to make. There's a lot of prep skew as they literally define the motion incorrectly. Like they defined it as something it isn't is. So we like could never predict that whatsoever. He also didn't bring this up until his second speech, which is completely unfair for us because I was arguing under the idea that we were debating the actual motion, and they didn't bring up this like new layer to their plan until the second speech. So like we had to change our entire case to argue under this in my partner's second speech as well, which is also really unfair. Like they could still warrant this using their stuff about vetoing, but trying to fiat it out is completely unfair to the opposition. But even if for some reason you don't buy this abusive call, and if you do, then we should just win the round because it makes the round completely unfair and really hard to debate for us. Even if you don't buy their abusive call, like let's use their actual warranting about why this would happen. The whole point about mother states vetoing, tell you this rarely happens. There's a lot of empirical evidence about this. Like the UK wouldn't try to veto Scotland. There's also other empirical examples of this happening. We give you like one specific one that we view would be really bad, and when I go into backlash, I'm gonna argue why our backlash point is like unique from this. But we think that this rarely happens, and that states rarely actually try and veto the other state from coming, especially even using their own logic. If you talk about like states wanting to be able to trade with their other states, they probably wouldn't veto it from happening, even if you don't buy the empirical examples. Moving on to the actual weighing in the round, right? First point I see, the first main clash is like who's actually strengthening the seceding state. We tell you that they're probably going to have a sort of newer economy that's not exactly ready to compete in the EU scale. This could lead to like economic failure, like what happened in Greece when they were trying to adjust to the EU things when they hadn't been doing that previously. If they're coming from a mother state already, we think that this just means that they're going to have a very fresh economy that isn't ready to adjust to this. But if they're coming from a former EU state, it's going to be even harder to adjust because then they're going to have to adjust to like EU currencies and things like that. When like the former state didn't have that already, it's going to be extremely hard for the economy to adjust and things like that. Even if you don't believe me, once again, my opponents still haven't provided any impacting as to why like seceding states are so important to the EU other than continuity. I'm going to go into that in a second. We tell you that seceding states are often so small and minuscule and such new countries, they don't have much to offer for the EU, and the EU has no like direct incentive to invite them into the state. So let's move on to like what's bad for the EU, because as the EU is passing this law, it probably cares about itself and like its functioning more than the functioning of a state that wouldn't even be a part of it. They tell you that it ruins continuity and countries may go to war. First of all, we tell you that the continuity doesn't really matter. They don't provide you any examples of like why this would be so bad or any seceding states that would actually cause like a rift in Europe whatsoever. I also think that China and Russia like won't want much from these states. They probably don't have much to offer as they're so new, and we don't see like what China and Russia are really going to be doing in these states that's going to be so terrible for the European Union. I also think that countries probably won't go to war, as this is a very new country. They don't want to like get into a conflict right away, and the relation with the other state is usually not that bad, right? Why is our side, why on their side do they actually do things that are bad for the European Union, right? First of all, we tell you that it makes them look lax because these countries probably aren't meeting the standards that you should be to accept the EU. Then essentially it's going to make the EU look not as strong because their countries aren't as strong in general. Also, this backlash point, really important, right? They're bypassing the veto, which is what leads to backlash from nations that would want to succeed, right? However, on our side, some countries don't actually want to veto them. It's more the idea that they'd be mad if the option is taken away, especially countries like Spain, which actually would want to veto. Countries would be angry that they don't have the choice to veto or not, and they would feel like they don't have much power in the European Union at all in general. It's also seen as incentivizing succession. I already warned this and it went unresponded to. I also think there would be backlash of other states. They didn't really respond to this. See all my warranting in my second contention. I also think that it's not going to affect the EU that much. There's no inherent incentive on their side, and it's just going to cause net negatives on their side as well, while they don't cause any positives whatsoever. And if you buy the abusive call, we should just win. So for those reasons, I urge next ballot. Thank you.
All right, we're just gonna be T, then Butters. I'm gonna go kind of big on T. All right, cool. Everyone good? All right, cool. Start time now. There's a couple of very key reasons why this isn't abusive in any case. They're literally just saying that a plan is abusive, which makes no sense. I'm going to warrant that out a little bit, but let's first start off. Remember, we gave you this plan from the very beginning of the first speech, which means that their entire argument about prep skew or anything like that simply does not flow and it makes no sense whatsoever. Remember, this is a parley round. We both had 20 minutes to prep this, and as a result, my partner and I were able to make up this plan, and they were able to respond to it because they had the 7 minutes of our speech to make a response, and they had their 8 minutes of their next speech to respond to this plan. They had the other block to respond to it, and they never responded to it simply because they couldn't come up with a good response. Their only response to it was given this frivolous T, which is a very bad issue, and it's abusive in and of itself, which is why you should vote AF. They're simply using frivolous T because they can't respond to the plan. There's a couple of key standards. First thing is on fairness. Remember, they had ample opportunities to respond to our plan, and only have this 5 minutes to respond to their T, but they've extended throughout 13 minutes or 12 minutes of their case. Second off, again, education. Remember, we're supposed to be acting as policymakers. The point of debate is to act as a policymaker and make the best policy you possibly can. And under this resolution, we basically explained to you how we're helping them in the membership process. And insofar as we're helping them in the membership process, this is very easily resolutional. But it's better education as well. It increases the educational quality of the round because we make a better plan and we're acting as better policymakers. And for that reason, again, because they're using T, it acts as a chilling effect against plans in general, which I don't really get. But basically, just because of that, it's bad. And then you should vote AF off of that alone because it's abusive. And they're simply trying to use frivolous T to chill plan and to get an easy W in this round, which again is bad. Yeah, again, remember, because we explained to you how membership is, remember, specifically, we explained and we give you tons of warning on how there is going to be a veto. They themselves give you Catalonia and Spain. They say how Spain would want to veto it from ever joining. And we give you other examples. We give you tons of examples. They keep double binding themselves. They say tensions aren't that high, but then they also give the backlash argument. The backlash argument is exactly why these mother nations wouldn't allow for them to join the EU. And that's exactly why it becomes important to institute the plan, because it allows them to join the membership process. And that's why it's resolutional. And that's why it's not abusive whatsoever. And that's why you should also be voting AF, because they're frivolous T. Now, onto the rest of the case. Just a couple of very key things. First of all, they just keep harping on the idea of they kind of double line themselves a lot, actually. They keep going on the case. They talk about strengthening seceding nations, and they talk about how it's not important for some reason. We explain to you explicitly why it is very important. We give you geographical continuity, but we also give the weakness that it institutes, because the mother nation that's still part of the EU, remember this plan talks about the current EU nations, remember the mother nation that is part of the EU gets weakened, which weakens the EU in general. That's why it's important to allow for them to become a candidate, because without that candidacy, there is no mediation between the EU and these two mother nations, and there is no trade between these two nations, which inherently weakens the EU. That's also the reason why the EU would step in and the reason why it does benefit. Second up, on the strengthening the seceding nation part, the point of them giving candidacy is that it allows for mediation between the two nations, because the EU steps in and acts as like the mediating presence. It's also what we've seen in like other countries that has seceded that they give examples to. And then second off, on the advantage to strengthening the EU, they don't really respond to this really well. They just talk about continually how our plan is abusive here. It was kind of odd. I'm just going to keep explaining. They talk about geographical continuity. They try to downplay this, but it's very important. What we're doing isn't like allowing for China and Russia to hack in. What we're allowing for, by allowing for this like kind of Swiss cheese of the EU, is first of all, we're slowing down and chilling trade between these nations, which inherently harms the EU as a trading group. But second off, it also allows for China and Russia to step in geographically. They're able to build like plants there. They're able to have a regional presence in that area, and that's what damages the EU, and that's what allows for China and Russia to increase their hedge so dramatically. And that's why we need to allow for these countries to become a candidate, because without that, these mother nations would simply veto it. It's never really directly responded to, other than like double-minding themselves a bunch of times. And because they're allowed to veto it, that's why these countries simply wouldn't be able to join, and that's why it's very important. By allowing these countries to gain candidacy, it means that as soon as they are given this candidacy from the EU, basically the EU steps in as a mediator and tries to help out as much as it can without damaging its own interests. And second off, what happens is that after it joins, if it fulfills the requirements that they themselves talked about, if they go through the formal membership negotiations after allowing for it to become a candidate, that's what will strengthen the EU, because overall it allows for a strong nation to become part of the EU. Now, on weighing, first is that we do enter into the status quo. In the status quo, for states to be offered membership, they have to be candidates, which is not possible for most secessionary nations because the mother states vetoed their acceptance as a candidacy. The plan establishes a policy that changes the status quo by offering membership, of which the first step is making them a candidate. This candidacy allows for the secessionary states to easily establish trade relationships and to help them succeed as well, because basically the EU steps in as a mediator, and that's what strengthens the nation. That's what allows it to properly succeed, as well as it becoming like a stronger actor. The formal negotiations allow for trade relations to be created while stability is achieved. Otherwise, simply wouldn't become a nation. And remember, they're not cutting in line because they're joining as part of the line. Before, they were excluded from the line in the neg world. They simply wouldn't be allowed to get in the line at all. But now they're being allowed into the line. That's the entire point of the plan. That's why we can status quo, and that's why you can very easily vote off the abuse and off of just and
All right, good round. Judge David and I are going to take a break to enter our ballots, and then we'll come back and give an RFD. All right, so that was a good round. That was a close round. It was a 1-1 split decision between Judge David and myself. So Judge David, do you want to go first or second?
It doesn't matter to me. You choose, please.
Sounds good. I'll go first then. To me, I think two things were true at the same time, which is one, both teams clearly deserve to be at NPDL-TOC / to go deep into elimination rounds at this tournament. Like in terms of team performance, both the Mountain House and Stuyvesant team were probably two of the best teams I've seen in 4 rounds so far. So as a person that's not at, or as a person who wasn't judging the round, but just observing, you both did excellent. And I hope you both go far. As a person that was judging the round ended up getting a bit messy around the second constructive speeches by both teams. And so the way that the round got a bit messy was, I think there's a norm in parley debate that many rounds that should better be debated as a fact or a value round end up getting debated as a policy round, either because of NPDL norms or because of local norms or regional norms, so on and so on. And the way that this worked out in practice is the first 2 constructives for the government ended up being, here is why this plan is a good idea. Then the second opposition constructive says, well, the plan text is abusive. If the plan text is abusive, then the case should go directly to the opposition, and then op should get our ballots. I don't necessarily think that the plan text was abusive, but I do think that there was a contradiction that was built into the government's plan text, where if the plan text says that they can become candidates, well, then all of the benefits that come from full membership into the EU become out of sample. If the plan text says they become a full member into the EU, then much of the issues of the plan potentially being abusive then becomes in sample, and then it becomes a bit of a messy round. And the reason why messiness is not good is all 4 of you had the highest speaker points I gave to anyone this tournament so far. Like, all 4 of you are excellent. But when chaos gets introduced into a debate, a lot of the times the default options of the biases of the judges could lead to differences in how we vote. And in this case, two excellent teams that did excellent work got into a bit of chaos towards the later stages of the debate. And whatever our default options were is what led us to, or at least what led me to vote my way, which is my default bias is tell me how I should evaluate the round, and then I'll evaluate it on that. If it was a fact round, Gov likely gets the ballot. If it was a value round, all things being equal, Gov likely gets the ballot. But because it's a policy round, I have to evaluate, does the policy work? And then does it also accomplish the goals? Versus just being a fact of, we should do this. With that said, both of you should, again, make it into deep stage elimination rounds at this tournament. You both were that good. Judge David, it's to you.
Okay. I think I agree with absolutely everything that Judge Jeff said. I think you were excellent in the debate, and I think that I completely agree that we ended up with some messiness on the tail end of this. I think what we ended up with in terms of different conclusions was I thought that this ended up being a combination of, it was a policy round, and so I ended up focusing a little bit more on the definitional fight that took place early on and the way in which the definitions were defined by Gov and not necessarily debated in the policy aspect by opposition. I agree that there were some real problematic aspects with the way in which the text then gets, the plain text aspect gets played out towards the end of the round, and the way in which that gets legitimately interpreted by opposition as abusive. But I did not think that there was enough to weigh that in and of itself, given that there is a step-by-step aspect to the government's position that there are 3 steps to EU membership. They outline them. They say to promote this particular policy, which is to try to provide groups that want to look at independence from current states. There was, I think, legitimate looking at Catalonia, because it is one of the categories that have not only had referendums that say that they would like to break away from Spain. Right next door to Catalonia is Basque region that hasn't had a referendum, but did end a 30-year war. It would like to break away. There was a fair amount of information tossed around about the relationship between Scotland and the UK. That's slightly a misnomer, because if Scotland decides to apply for EU membership, it would not be the UK that would be in veto of that, because Scotland is in fact a member of the UK. It would be a fight between Scotland and Britain. And the referendum that took place in Scotland was done under a false brokerage deal, because the people who were pushing it were still members of the British Parliament, even though they were Scottish members. And there's probably going to be another referendum in Scotland that will not have the fingers of the British government in it, and thereby will not be a, quote, UK veto. It will be an internal Scottish matter about whether they break away from the UK, and then it will be a British-Scottish issue, not an UK issue. That aside, there are a number of other questions about how mother countries, Italy being one, whether Italy breaks into two countries. That's certainly an ongoing debate. But these are all questions about the steps by which a subset of an existing EU country chooses the path or has the choice of becoming a new EU country. The text does have offer membership. That's a key word for me in terms of the text, and that actually didn't get debated at all. What got debated was membership qua membership, and the government took the existing pathway to membership and eliminated the biggest stumbling block that currently exists, which is veto power, and said, take veto power off the table and institute the existing pathways. That strikes me as a definitional fight. I think it would have been much more interesting if we had continued with that definitional fight instead of having some interesting back and forth and then deciding that later in the debate that we're just going to focus on the plain text and talk about abusiveness, which I didn't find productive and or educationally interesting. That's why I ended up at a opposite conclusion from Judge Jeff, but that doesn't change the fact that it was two very, very good teams going after a poorly worded resolution. Okay.
Yeah, thank you guys, and good luck to you.
Good luck.
Thank you, Judgy. Good
Yep,
luck.
of course.
Thank you both for judging.